Welcome to the News Hour, Sam. So good to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, and we have really appreciated how you're able to, for those of us who are not in the business of law, figure out exactly how to best navigate some of these things through competent legal assistance.
Michael, the definition of genius is not in making easy things difficult. The definition of genius is making difficult things seem easy.
Absolutely. Well, let's visit just a little bit about your business so that we can bring people up to speed. You're primarily a business law attorney, but you also bring something called a CPA to the equation as well. How does that, do you believe, help your clients?
I would argue that accounting is the language of business. And I would tell you that business includes, but is not limited to, some estate planning issues too, which is really what I'm here to talk about today. What happens to your business if something happens to you?
Wow. Yeah, and that is a real serious concern. Nobody likes to think of it. Nobody wants to, I mean, that's estate planning, wills and trusts and those kinds of things. Nobody likes to think of it. But folks that are in owner-managed companies like you and I, have some exposure when it comes to issues of what happens to our business if something happens to us.
Michael, stuff happens.
Yeah.
And you can't exactly decide when or where. There's a very funny commercial about your heart attack is going to occur next Thursday. But I've got to tell you that you've got a choice. And the choice is you can take control of the situation, plan for these things, consider some of your options, or you can just sort of let it happen. Both ways are fine. But I would tell you that most people who take the time and the effort to grow their own business want to know what happened. They want to be in control. They want to be able to determine the future of their business.
Well, in most owner-managed companies, that is the bread and butter that provides for their home and their family.
And it's an asset which is fundamentally different than other types of assets because it's more of a living, breathing thing than it is a stock or a bond or a piece of real estate. A business is a going concern. So how it works in a conjunction with an estate plan, how it works in conjunction with living plans, these are very big issues which really kind of ought to be addressed at the front end rather than when it's too late.
Absolutely. So when you're involved in the creation of a business, these are some of the things that you ought to be thinking about while you create a business. But it's really never too late, is it, to get into the nuts and bolts of fixing it?
The only time it's too late is when it's too late.
When it's too late.
That's back to the joke about genius making difficult things simple.
Right.
If somebody becomes incapacitated, if someone has a stroke, if somebody has a car crash, if somebody passes away, then it's too late. Up until then, there's plenty of time. Everything should be done in its own time. And what I mean by that is, we're coming up to Thanksgiving. We're coming up to the new year. Many companies do their budgeting at this time. Now is the time to really be thinking about these things.
Factors that we need to think about when we're reviewing our budget strategy, and you just hinted at that for the new year. What are some of the things we ought to be thinking about?
As far as budgeting matters?
Well, no, not budgeting matters, but we tend to be in that budgeting area for the new year. So we can also be in future planning for the new year about our business and also what we do if something happens to us. What should we be thinking about?
Well, there are many things to be thinking about. What I really wanted to talk about today is making ownership decisions for the business. Now, in another presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about operational decisions. I'm going to talk about some other things. But today, what I really want to talk about are ownership decisions. Now, what I mean by ownership decisions are things that impact the business because you're an owner. There are things like who votes the stock. It's things like who decides whether to sell the assets, who decides whether to make a merger, who decides on the future of the business. And I think these are critical decisions, and I think it depends in part on what type of business you are. And then I think it depends on where you are in the process. Let's talk for just a second of what type of business. If you're a corporation, your business is controlled by both the bylaws of the corporation and Iowa Code Section 490. Okay? And what it provides is the owners of the business are the shareholders. Okay? Now, the shareholders have certain things that they get to do. the number one thing they should get to do is cash a dividend check. The number two thing they do is they elect the directors, and it's actually the directors who run the business. A third thing they do is they can amend bylaws. A fourth thing they can do is they can approve sale or merger of companies. But one of the real things that shareholders do is they have the ownership interest. Limited liability companies are a little bit different.
True.
Okay. Now, with a limited liability company, you really have two flavors, the chocolate and the vanilla. Okay. And the chocolate, which is slightly more exotic, is the manager-managed limited liability company. What that means is not everybody who owns it runs it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The vanilla is where everybody owns, everybody plays. In that situation, I would tell you that if something happens to you and you're a member, okay, where everybody owns, everybody plays, it can actually be much more devastating for the business if you've got co-owners. The reason for that is the Iowa Code provides that if somebody passes or becomes incapacitated, the alternate decision maker, and I'll talk a little bit about, powers of attorney and trustees and executors, but the alternate decision maker gets an economic interest, but not a decision-making interest.
So it takes it negates the chance that they're going to do something incorrect?
No, actually what it does is it limits their voice. They can no longer vote for managers. Basically, they have no control of the business.
And why would that be?
The answer is if you've got an ongoing business, you should know who you're in business with. And if you become a transferee of that business, whether that transferee is voluntary through some type of sale or transfer, or whether that transfer is involuntary due to a death or a disability, the code provides that you become a transferee and you basically only have an economic interest. You don't get any say in the business. Now, in a manager-managed limited liability company, basically it's the same thing, but with a different problem. The same thing is that the transferee gets the economic interest, but no voting rights. But additionally, the transferee gets very limited rights to find out what's going on in the company.
Really?
So it depends a little bit on who is going to be your alternate decision maker, but it also depends on what you own, how you're structured.
And these are all decisions and thought processes you should do when you're creating the business, or you can do this at any time during the process?
The answer is sort of both. There's no substitute for doing it right the first time,
there
right?
You go. Yeah.
Having said that, you can change. Okay, you can create a limited liability company and have it be treated for tax purposes as though it's an S corporation. So for tax purposes, you can shift between. You can create a corporation from a limited liability company through a conversion, and you can liquidate a corporation in order to reform it as. So there is some ability to move between types of entities. But the real question is what happens next. Not only what is an ownership decision, the question is who decides. Okay? The real question on who decides is at what point in the incapacity continuum are you?
Does someone make a decision?
Now, if you are incapacitated or can't make a decision for whatever reason, then you have two options. One, you can have a power of attorney established, whereby the holder of the power of attorney makes those decisions for you, those economic decisions for you. You decide, you draft the document, you establish their powers. The second is to not plan. And if you don't plan, then what happens is a conservatorship gets established. And that's a court-appointed person who may or may not have the expertise.
The best interests of the company.
Well, no, they always are supposed to have the same interests, meaning the holder of the power of attorney and the conservator are required to act in accordance with the best interests of the individual.
Got it.
The problem is the best interests of the individual may not be the same as the company. Similarly, when someone passes, you've got two choices. You could have a will which establishes who's going to make these decisions. Or you could go without a will, and the court will decide who makes the decisions on whatever basis the court wants to decide who's going to be appointed the administrator. There's one other thing that's very important, and then we can go to other issues relative to this whole process. And that is the role of a surviving spouse. A surviving spouse has a statutory right to elect against a will. So even if you own the shares, own the membership interests, and you have in a will, I give everything to my beloved son Sam. No. A surviving spouse
has that
has
power.
A right to 1/3. Okay? Mm-hmm. And what is comprising that 1/3 is a point of contention in many cases. The second thing you should be aware of is if you don't have a will, the spouse gets everything if the spouse's children are also your children. What I mean by that is if my wife and I are married, we have 4 children, I pass, no will, she gets everything. Conversely, if my wife and I are married, we have 2 children, and I have 2 children by a second marriage, in a blended family, which is becoming more and more common,
popular, yeah.
Then she gets half, and the surviving children get half.
So that's a real issue, can be a real issue in the survivorship of the spouse.
Not only the survivorship
and the company,
but also the company.
Yeah.
The other thing to be aware of is you can fix this. The way you can fix this is with some kind of buy-sell agreement, with some type of continuation planning. We talked at the very beginning of this discussion about the importance of the Thanksgiving holidays, the New Year, all of those types of things. It's a good time for the owner of a family business to sit with the family and to actually discuss these kinds of things, even if these are sometimes a slightly uncomfortable conversation. Really can be actually more comfortable, because what's happening is the owner of the business is taking charge of the business's future.
And making those decisions while they can. Yeah. Thank you, Sam, as always.
Glad
to
be
Good stuff.
Here.
You know, this is always interesting because, you know, all of us who are in owner-managed businesses, we spend so much time owning and managing a business that sometimes these other things slip by the side.
Michael, there's 2 things that an owner has to do. An owner has to work on the business, and the owner has to work in the business.
That's right.
And those 2 things are different. What we're talking about today is the business itself, not the business of the business. In a later presentation in December, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what operational things happen if somebody can't run them for themselves.
Sam Kreamer, ladies and gentlemen, from the Kreamer Law Firm, always insightful with his comments relative to business and business law. And, of course, he brings that CPA adjustment to it, too, which also helps make it more real. Thank you, Sam. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
We're going to take a quick break for the Wall Street Journal report, listen in to the Iowa stocks of local interest, and then, yet this half hour, Jeff Stein comes in, and we're going to be talking about the politics of business advertising. What? Hang in there with us. This is Inside on Business, the News Hour.